The steam engine breathed a tired, gray sigh into the heat of the afternoon, and the sound was the only thing that had moved in an hour. Silas stood on the far end of the platform, his shadow a long, thin cut in the baked dust, his hat pulled low enough that the world was just a sliver of bleached wood and shimmering iron track. He was not waiting for anyone, and no one was waiting for him, which was the way he had arranged his life until the arrangement felt less like a choice and more like a law of nature, like the sun rising or the creek running dry in August. The train was just something to watch, a noisy interruption in the vast and settled silence he called peace, a reminder that there was a world beyond the edge of town where people were always in a hurry to get somewhere else. He watched the porter throw down the metal step with a clang that echoed in the heavy air, and he watched the two men in dusty suits get off, followed by a woman fanning her face with a lace handkerchief, because watching was a thing a man could do without having to have an opinion. It cost nothing. It asked nothing. A shape appeared in the shadowed doorway of the passenger car, a hesitation before it stepped into the blinding sun. It was a woman, though from this distance she was just a dark dress and a posture of bone-deep weariness. She moved slowly, carefully, as if the ground itself were fragile, and in her arms she held a bundle wrapped in a pale yellow blanket, a bundle she adjusted with a practiced, unconscious gesture that spoke of sleepless nights and a constant, low-grade fear. She stepped onto the platform and the train hissed again behind her, a final exhalation before it began the slow, groaning process of departure. She did not look back at it. She stood perfectly still as the pistons churned and the great wheels began to turn, her eyes fixed on the single dusty street of the town of Redemption, a name that felt like a cruel joke in the unforgiving glare of the sun. The other passengers had already dispersed, melting into the livery or the hotel saloon, but she remained, a solitary island in the swirling dust kicked up by the departing train. Silas watched her. He watched the way her shoulders were set, not slumped in defeat, but braced against it, and he watched the way she scanned the faces of the few onlookers, the storekeeper wiping down his window, the blacksmith leaning in his doorway, looking for something she clearly did not find. The train's whistle gave a long, mournful cry as it rounded the bend, and then there was only the silence again, thicker now, heavier, because she was in it. She was a question nobody had asked, and Silas had a feeling the town would not be in a hurry to find an answer. He remained in his sliver of shade, a statue carved from patience and dust, and continued to watch as the woman took a single, uncertain step forward, her whole world held in a fragile bundle against her chest. Afternoon. The heat did not break, it simply settled, a physical weight on the shoulders and the soul. Silas had left the station without a word, his long strides eating up the distance to his small homestead on the edge of town, a place marked by a well-mended fence and two good horses in the corral. His world was one of leather and sweat, of the patient work of turning a wild thing into a compliant one. And he understood the language of horses better than he understood the language of men. A horse told you everything you needed to know with the flick of an ear, or the tension in its flank. It did not lie or prevaricate, it simply was. He spent the remainder of the day resetting a shoe on the bay mare, the rhythmic clang of his hammer against the anvil, a steady, reassuring beat against the oppressive silence. He worked with an economy of motion that was its own kind of grace, his hands, calloused and scarred, moving with absolute certainty. They were not gentle hands, but they were knowing hands. He knew how much pressure to apply, when to soothe and when to command, and the mare stood for him, trusting him in a way people rarely did. He finished the job and ran a hand down the horse's neck, a quiet communion that needed no words, before turning his attention to a fraying cinch strap, the repetitive motion of needle and awl through thick leather a meditation. This was his life, a series of small, necessary tasks, each one performed with the same deliberate focus. And it was enough. It had to be. He could feel the sun begin its slow descent by the change in the quality of the light, the harsh white glare softening to a dusty gold that caught in the motes of hay floating in the barn. He straightened his back, feeling the familiar ache, and looked toward the town. He could not see the station from here, but he could picture it. The empty platform, the settled dust. He could picture her. He wondered where a woman like that, with a baby and no luggage to speak of, would go. It was not his concern. He told himself that. It was not his concern. That night, the moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky. Silas sat on his porch, a tin cup of cooled coffee in his hand, listening to the night sounds, the crickets, the distant yip of a coyote, the soft sigh of the horses in the corral. These were the sounds of his solitude, the familiar chorus that assured him all was as it should be. But tonight, There was a discord, a thread of unease he could not name. He thought of the woman on the platform, the set of her jaw, the fierce way she held the child. He had seen that look before, on a doe cornered by wolves. A look that was equal parts terror and defiance. He finished his coffee and went inside, the small cabin spare and clean, everything in its place. A single bed, a small table, a stone fireplace. It was the house of a man who expected no visitors and desired none. He lay on his bunk, his hands behind his head, and stared up at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling. He thought of the town, of Sheriff Brody, a man who maintained order by preferring not to notice things that might disrupt it. He thought of the women of the church guild, their piety, a sharp-edged thing they used to measure the worth of others. He thought of the men in the saloon, their laughter loud and their judgment swift. Redemption was not a town that opened its arms to strangers, especially not to a woman alone with a child and a story she was not telling. It was a town that would watch and whisper and wait for her to fail. He closed his eyes, willing sleep to come, but the image of her standing alone on that platform remained, burned into the back of his eyelids. A question, a disruption. He rolled onto his side, turning his back to the empty room, but the feeling of it, the wrongness of it, followed him into the dark. Days later, the woman was still there. He saw her from a distance, a ghost haunting the edges of the town. Her name, he'd heard someone say in the general store, was Alara. She had been turned away from the boarding house because she had no money for a week in advance, and the hotel clerk had looked right through her, his face a mask of polite refusal. She was sleeping, Silas guessed, in the abandoned livery stable at the east end of town, a place that offered little more than a leaky roof and the company of rats. He saw her one morning by the town pump, washing the pale yellow blanket in a bucket, her movements slow with exhaustion, the baby lying on a patch of grass beside her, startlingly quiet. The other women at the pump gave her a wide berth, their silence a judgment more damning than any words. They filled their buckets and left, their backs rigid, and Alara did not seem to notice. Or if she did, she gave no sign. Her focus was on the blanket, on the child, on the simple act of survival. Silas was leaving the mercantile, a sack of flour over his shoulder, when he saw Fletcher approach her. Fletcher was a land agent, a man who dressed in tailored suits that always looked out of place against the town's dust and grit, and he moved with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world owed him whatever he decided to take. He was smiling, a predator's smile that did not reach his cold eyes. He stopped before Alara, blocking her path to the pump. Silas was too far away to hear the words, but he saw the way Fletcher leaned in, the way his eyes roamed over her, the casual insolence in his posture. He saw Alara stiffen, her hand hovering protectively over the sleeping child. She said something, a short, clipped answer, and Fletcher laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. He said something more, then turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of the bucket. She stood frozen for a long moment, staring after him, and in that moment, Silas saw not fear, but a flicker of pure, cold hatred in her eyes. It was a look he recognized. It was a look he had seen in the mirror. He shifted the weight of the flour sack on his shoulder and made a decision. It was not a thought, not a plan, just a quiet turning inside him, like a key in a lock. He walked the length of the street, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. She was still by the pump, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking almost imperceptibly. The baby stirred and made a soft, mewling sound. She bent and scooped the child into her arms, rocking it gently, her face hidden from view. He stopped a few feet away from her. He did not know what he was going to say. Words were not his tools. They were clumsy and imprecise, and he had long since lost the habit of them. He cleared his throat. The sound was rough, alien. She looked up, startled, her eyes wide and wary. They were gray eyes, the color of a stormy sky, and they were filled with an exhaustion so profound it seemed to have settled into her very bones. He saw the faint purple smudges beneath them, the hollows in her cheeks. He looked away from her face, toward the hills beyond the town. "You can use the barn," he said. The words came out low and gravelly from disuse. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. She did not know him. He was just another man in a dusty town, and she had no reason to trust him. She clutched the baby tighter. "The loft is clean," he added, still not looking at her. "There's a pump. It's dry." He did not offer comfort or pity, only facts. A place, water, shelter. He was offering a trade, a practical solution to a practical problem, because that was a language he understood. He did not know what he was asking for in return, maybe nothing. maybe just an end to the wrongness of it. The image of her standing alone on that platform. She watched him for a long, silent minute, her gaze searching his face for a hint of Fletcher's sly cruelty or the town's cold judgment. She found neither, only a kind of profound stillness, a neutrality that was more reassuring than any offered smile. "Why?" she asked, her voice a dry whisper. It was the first time he'd heard her speak. He finally met her eyes. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. It was the only answer he had. He turned and started walking toward his homestead, not looking back to see if she was following. He did not need to. He could hear the soft scuff of her worn boots in the dust behind him. The walk was silent. The sun beat down, and the only sound was their footsteps and the soft breathing of the child in her arms. He led her past the edge of town, onto the path that cut through the tall, dry grass toward his property. He was acutely aware of her presence behind him, a small, determined shadow dogging his own. He did not slow his pace, nor did he quicken it. He simply walked, and she simply followed, a silent compact made between two strangers who had run out of other options. When they reached his fence, he unlatched the gate and held it open for her, a gesture of plain country courtesy. And she passed through without a word, her eyes taking in the neat, orderly homestead. She saw the two horses watching her with placid curiosity, the tidy woodpile, the clean-swept porch of the small cabin. It was a place of solitude, but not of neglect. It was a place that was cared for. He led her to the barn. The air inside was cool and smelled of hay and leather and horse. It was a good smell. He gestured toward the ladder leading to the loft. "Up there," he said. "I'll bring a bucket of water." He left her then, giving her space, and went to his own well pump. As he worked the handle, the rhythmic squeak and splash of water filling the bucket was a comforting, normal sound, in a day that had been anything but. He was a man who lived by routine, by the predictable cycle of chores, and he had just invited chaos into the heart of it. He did not understand why. He only knew that leaving her by the town pump had become an impossibility, an act he could not have lived with. He carried the full bucket back to the barn and set it at the bottom of the ladder. He could hear her moving around in the loft above, the soft rustle of straw. He turned to go, to leave her to her privacy, but her voice stopped him. "Thank you," she said. It was quiet, but clear. He paused in the wide doorway, his back to her. He nodded once, a curt, small movement, and then walked out into the sunlight, feeling as though he had just stepped off a cliff into empty air. That night, a new sound joined the chorus of the crickets and the coyotes. It was the sound of a baby crying, a thin, hungry wail that cut through the darkness from the barn. Silas lay on his bunk, listening. He had left a small bundle on the bottom rung of the loft ladder before he'd retired to his cabin, a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and an apple from the mercantile, wrapped in a clean cloth. He had done it without thinking, a simple act, like putting out feed for the horses. He hoped she had found it. The crying persisted, a raw, desperate sound that scraped at something deep inside him. He thought of getting up, of going to the barn, but he did not know what he would do when he got there. He was a man who gentled horses, not babies. He knew nothing of their needs or their pains. He stayed where he was, a prisoner of the sound, and felt the ordered walls of his solitude begin to crack. The crying eventually subsided, replaced by a low humming sound, a lullaby so soft it was almost part of the wind. He closed his eyes. He had not heard a woman's voice singing in this place. Not ever. He had built this life for himself, a fortress of silence, and now it had been breached. He did not know if he was grateful or terrified. Weeks later, a rhythm established itself, unspoken and unnegotiated. Alara and the child, a little girl she called Rose, lived in the loft. During the day, while Silas worked the horses or mended fences, Alara would work in the shade of the barn. She was a quiet, tireless worker. She took over the mending of his clothes, her stitches small and neat, far better than his own clumsy repairs. She started a small garden patch near the well, coaxing stubborn green shoots from the dry soil. She never asked for anything, and she never offered any information about her past. They rarely spoke. Their communication was a series of gestures and actions. He would leave a portion of his supplies, flour, beans, coffee, on the barn steps, and later, he would find a hot plate of food on his own porch. He would chop extra wood, and she would stack it. It was a partnership of necessity, a shared existence that hovered in the space between charity and employment. He learned things about her in small, incidental ways. He saw her one afternoon teaching herself the brands of the local ranches from a discarded almanac, her brow furrowed in concentration. He noticed that her hands, though calloused now from the garden, had the long, slender fingers of someone who might have once played the piano. And he saw the way she looked at Rose, a fierce, all-consuming love that was the sun around which her entire world turned. The baby, for her part, was growing stronger, her cries less frequent, her eyes a deep, curious blue. Sometimes Silas would catch himself watching them from the corral fence, the woman and the child, a small, self-contained world of their own, and he would feel a strange pang in his chest, a feeling he could not name, like the memory of a language he had long forgotten. The town continued to watch. Their arrangement was a source of endless speculation. Whispers followed Silas when he went to the mercantile. He ignored them. He had long ago learned that the opinions of others were a currency he had no use for, but he saw the way the whispers affected Alara. When she had to go into town for something she couldn't grow or make, she would walk with her head held high, her back straight, but he saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she avoided meeting anyone's eyes. She was a marked woman, an outsider who had found shelter with another outsider, and the town did not approve. Fletcher, in particular, seemed to take their arrangement as a personal affront. He would ride by the property slowly, his gaze lingering on the barn, on Alara, as she worked in her garden. He never stopped, he never spoke, but his presence was a constant, low-level threat, a promise of trouble yet to come. Silas felt it, a coiling in his gut whenever he saw the man's fine-coated horse on the road. He knew that men like Fletcher did not give up on something they wanted. They were patient. They waited for the right moment, for a sign of weakness. And Silas knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that Fletcher had not forgotten Alara, or the cold fire he had seen in her eyes by the town pump. The quiet peace they had built was fragile, a thin pane of glass, waiting for the first stone to be thrown. One evening, as dusk was settling and painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange, Silas was cleaning his tools by the light of a lantern hung in the barn. Alara came down the ladder from the loft, the sleeping baby held securely in a sling against her chest. She approached him hesitantly. This was unusual. Their paths rarely crossed in the evenings. They respected the invisible boundaries of each other's space. She stopped a few feet from him, her hands twisting a loose thread on her apron. "The bay mare," she said, her voice low. "She favors her left foreleg." Silas stopped wiping down a curry comb and looked at the mare in the nearby stall. He had not noticed. He had been so preoccupied with the tension from Fletcher's constant surveillance that he had missed it. He walked over to the stall and ran his hand down the horse's leg, feeling for heat or swelling. The mare shifted her weight, a clear sign of discomfort. Alara was right. She might have picked up a stone, he said, his voice gruff, or strained it. He was annoyed with himself for his lack of observation. Alara came to stand beside him at the stall door. "My father raised horses," she said quietly. It was the first piece of her past she had ever offered. A small, carefully chosen stone dropped into the deep well of her silence. "He taught me to read the signs." Silas looked at her, really looked at her, not as a problem he had to solve or a responsibility he had taken on, but as a person with a history, with knowledge. He saw the intelligence in her clear gray eyes, the quiet competence that mirrored his own. "He said you listen with your hands, not just your ears," she added, her gaze on the mare. It was a piece of wisdom he himself lived by, a truth he had learned over years of patient work. In that moment, the distance between them shrank. They were not just a man and a woman bound by circumstance. They were two people who understood the same silent language. "I need to get a new poultice mix from the mercantile," Silas said, more to himself than to her. "The one I have is old." He hated going into town after dark, hated the noise from the saloon, the prying eyes. "There's comfrey root by the creek," Alara said, "and yarrow. If you have flaxseed, I can make one." He turned to face her fully, surprised. "You know herbs?" She gave a small, self-deprecating shrug. "My mother believed a woman should know how to heal things. It was useful." The way she said the word useful was freighted with a history he could only guess at, a story of a life where a woman's worth was measured by her utility. He nodded slowly. "There's flaxseed in the cabin, in a tin canister on the shelf." He watched as she went to fetch it, her movements efficient and purposeful. She was not the helpless creature he had first seen on the train platform. That woman was gone, or perhaps had never really existed. In her place was this person of quiet strength and hidden skills, a person who knew horses and herbs, a person who had survived. He realized with a jolt that he had underestimated her. Everyone had, and he suspected that men like Fletcher made a habit of underestimating women like Alara, a mistake that could prove costly. She returned with the tin and set about her work, crushing the herbs with a smooth stone, her hands moving with a knowledge passed down. He watched her, the lantern light catching the stray wisps of hair around her face, and felt the last of his defenses crumble. She was not a complication. She was not a burden. She was a partner, and he would protect her. He would protect this fragile piece they had built. He knew, with a cold, hard certainty, that he would soon be called upon to do so. The confrontation, when it came, was not a surprise. It arrived on a Tuesday, in the late afternoon, under a sky the color of lead. Silas was in the corral, working with a young colt on a long line, teaching it to yield to pressure, when he saw the three riders approaching. Fletcher was in the lead, flanked by two hard-faced men Silas knew by sight from the saloon. They were the kind of men who hired out their loyalty to the highest bidder, their presence an unspoken threat. They stopped their horses just outside the fence, their shadows falling long and distorted across the dusty ground. The colt shied, its eyes rolling. Silas calmed it with a low word and a steady hand on the line, his own body perfectly still, his attention fixed on the men. He did not call out a greeting. He waited. Fletcher dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, and leaned against the fence rail, hooking his thumbs in his waistcoat. He looked casual, relaxed, as if he were merely paying a social call. His smile was a thin, unpleasant slash in his face. "Silas," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Working hard, I see. A man of routine." Silas said nothing. He just stood there, the training line held loosely in his hand, a silent pillar of opposition. He knew this was not about him. This was about her. He could feel her presence in the barn behind him, a sudden stillness where moments before there had been the soft sounds of her work. She was listening. She was waiting. "I've come for the woman," Fletcher said, getting straight to the point. His pretense of civility had vanished. "Her name is Alara Vance, or it was. She's the wife of Mr. Alistair Vance, of the Eastern Vance Corporation, a very wealthy, very powerful man." He paused, letting the name sink in, letting its weight do the work for him. "She ran away, stole a great deal of his property, not least of which is his infant daughter." Silas's expression did not change. He had suspected something like this, a story of wealth and control, a gilded cage. She had been desperate enough to flee. It didn't matter. The reasons did not matter. "She's not here," Silas said, his voice flat and even. It was a poor lie, and they all knew it. Fletcher's smile widened. "Don't be a fool, Silas. We know she's here. The whole town knows. They've been enjoying the little show you two have been putting on." He pushed himself off the fence. "Mr. Vance is a generous man. He's authorized me to offer a reward for her return. $500, a fortune for a man like you. Enough to buy a good stud, some more land." He let the offer hang in the air, a glittering temptation. $500 was more money than Silas had seen in 5 years. It was the price of a different life. He could feel the eyes of Fletcher's men on him, measuring him, judging him. He could feel Alara's fear, a palpable thing radiating from the shadowed doorway of the barn. He looked at Fletcher, at his expensive suit and his smug, confident face, and he felt nothing but a cold, clean disgust. He had nothing to sell. "She's not for sale," Silas said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a hammer blow. Fletcher's smile vanished. His face hardened into a mask of cold fury. "I see," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "So you're not a businessman. You're a romantic, a protector of fallen women. How noble." He took a step toward the gate. "I'm not asking, Silas. I'm telling you. I have a legal writ here for her return, signed by a circuit judge. You're harboring a fugitive and a thief. You can step aside and take the money, or you can stand in my way and end up in a federal jail. Your little farm sold off to pay the fines." He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. He held it up. "This is the law. You have no say in the matter." The two men with him shifted in their saddles, their hands moving to rest on the butts of the pistols holstered at their hips. The air grew thick, heavy with the promise of violence. The colt, sensing the tension, snorted and pulled at the line. Silas kept his grip steady. He did not look at the paper. He did not look at the men. He looked at Fletcher. He thought of Alara, of the way her hands moved when she worked, of the quiet dignity she had fought so hard to reclaim. He thought of the baby, Rose, sleeping peacefully, ignorant of the ugliness of the world that wanted to claim her. He thought of the life he had built here, his fortress of silence. He had built it to keep the world out, but now he realized it was also a place to keep something safe within. The choice was simple. It had been made weeks ago, when he saw her standing alone on the train platform. He had not known it then, but he knew it now. Some things were not transactional. Some things were not for sale. A person's worth, a person's soul. He let the training line drop into the dust. The colt, freed, trotted to the far side of the corral. Silas took a slow step forward, planting his feet, his body a silent declaration. He placed himself directly in the path to the barn. He did not raise his voice, he did not make a threat. He just stood there, his hands loose at his sides, his face calm and unreadable. He was not a gunman, he was not a fighter, he was a horsebreaker. He knew about pressure, and he knew about resistance. He knew that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was to refuse to yield, to simply hold your ground. "No," he said. It was just one word. Fletcher's face contorted with rage. He was not used to being told no. He was a man who bought and sold and bullied his way through the world, a world that always bent to his will. "You pathetic, broken-down sodbuster," he spat. "You think you can stop me?" He started for the gate, his hand reaching for his own pistol. "Get him!" he snarled at his men. The two men dismounted, their movements quick and practiced. They started to spread out, flanking him. The moment hung, suspended, taut as a wire, and then a voice, clear and steady, cut through the tension. "He is not alone." Alara stepped out of the barn. She was holding an old, heavy-looking shotgun, the kind used for hunting geese. She held it not with the clumsy fear of someone unfamiliar with firearms, but with a steady, competent grip. The stock settled firmly against her shoulder. The twin barrels pointed directly at Fletcher's chest. Rose was no longer with her. She must have hidden the child somewhere safe. Her face was pale, but her eyes were like chips of flint. There was no fear in them now, only resolve. "You will not take my daughter," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that stunned the men into silence. They had come for a frightened runaway. They had found a queen defending her throne. Fletcher stopped dead, his eyes wide with disbelief. He stared at the shotgun, then at Alara's face. The two hired men froze, their hands hovering over their guns, suddenly unsure of the odds. They had been paid to intimidate a lone woman and a quiet horseman, not to walk into a double-barreled shotgun blast. Their loyalty, Silas knew, was only as deep as their sense of self-preservation. Silas did not move. He did not look at Alara. He kept his eyes on Fletcher. The entire world seemed to have shrunk to the space between them, the dusty ground, the tense silence. He saw the calculation in Fletcher's eyes, the rapid assessment of risk and reward. He saw the man's blustering confidence begin to crumble, replaced by a sullen, resentful anger. He had misjudged them. He had misjudged them both, badly. He had seen a broken woman and a simple man. He had failed to see the steel beneath. The standoff stretched for another 10 seconds, an eternity in which the only sound was the wind whispering through the dry grass. Then, with a curse under his breath, Fletcher lowered his hand from his pistol. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice thick with impotent rage. He snatched the writ from the air where he'd held it, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it to the ground. He turned without another word, swung himself into his saddle, and spurred his horse into a gallop, his two men scrambling to mount and follow, leaving a cloud of dust and humiliation in their wake. They were gone. Silas stood for a long moment, listening to the fading thunder of their hoofbeats. He bent down and picked up the crumpled ball of paper from the dust. He did not open it. He simply held it in his hand. Alara did not lower the shotgun until the riders were a distant speck on the horizon. Then, the tension seemed to drain out of her all at once, and the heavy gun sagged in her arms. He walked over to her. He gently took the shotgun from her hands. It was heavy, solid. He broke it open. It was not loaded. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. A small, tired smile touched her lips. "My father also taught me that the threat of a thing is often more powerful than the thing itself." He closed the breech with a solid click and looked out at the empty road, at the peaceful hills beyond. The threat was gone, for now. Order had been restored, but on new terms. They had held their ground. They were still standing, months later. The first snow of winter was falling. Fat, wet flakes that melted into the dark earth, promising a season of quiet and rest. A new room had been built onto the side of the cabin, small but sturdy, with a proper window that looked out over the corral. Smoke curled from the cabin's stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the heavy white sky. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering light on the room. Silas sat at the table, carefully oiling a piece of tack, his hands moving with their familiar, patient rhythm. Across from him, Alara sat with a ledger book open, a pencil in her hand, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had taken over his accounts, her neat columns and precise figures bringing an order to his finances that had never existed before. She had discovered he was owed money by 3 different ranchers who had been slow to pay, and she had drafted letters, polite but firm, that had resulted in checks arriving by the next post. She had a mind for business, a sharp, clear intelligence that had been lying dormant. On a thick blanket by the fire, Rose, now a babbling toddler, played with a set of wooden blocks Silas had carved for her. Her laughter was a bright, happy sound that filled the small spaces of the cabin, a sound that had become as natural and necessary as the crackle of the fire. The town's whispers had not stopped entirely, but their tone had changed. Suspicion had been replaced by a grudging respect. They were no longer Silas the recluse and the runaway woman. They were Silas and Alara, a unit, a family of their own making. Fletcher had not returned. Word had come back that he had left the territory, his reputation damaged by his failure. The great and powerful Mr. Vance, it seemed, did not tolerate incompetence. The threat had passed, leaving behind a hard-won peace. Alara finished her calculations and looked up, her gray eyes meeting his across the table. She smiled, a real smile, one that reached her eyes and transformed her face. He nodded in return. No words were needed. They had built a life here, not out of passion or romance, but out of something quieter and perhaps more durable, mutual respect, shared work, and a profound, unspoken gratitude. They had found sanctuary in each other's solitude. He looked at the child playing by the fire, at the woman who had faced down her past with an empty shotgun and unshakable courage, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was home. There is a quiet strength in the person who stands their ground, not with fists or with anger, but with the simple, unshakable conviction of their own worth. We often look for heroes in the noise, in the grand gestures, and the loud declarations. But sometimes, the greatest courage is found in the silence, in the decision to offer shelter, to stand with someone when no one else will, to refuse to be bought when your integrity is on the line. What we just saw was a story about 2 people who the world had tried to break, who found in each other not a solution to their problems, but the quiet resolve to face them. They remind us that dignity is not something that can be given or taken away by others. It is something you claim for yourself in the small, everyday choices you make. Thank you for spending this time with us, for listening to this story. If it moved you, we hope you'll consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories like this one. And we'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. What does it mean to you to find your own piece of peace, your own place of redemption, in a world that can often feel so loud and unforgiving? Until next time, be well and be kind to the quiet souls you meet along the way. They may just be the strongest people you will ever know.